Okay, so back to the problem it's trying to solve. So XRP Ledger is specifically trying to solve payments, right? And why is it trying to do that? The consensus algorithm that it chose has a very high throughput. It's roughly 1,500 transactions per second. Whereas, Bitcoin has 3 to 4 transactions per second. Ethereum is, I think, 15 transactions per second, something like that. But so what does that mean when you have the availability of 1,500 transactions per second as your settlement layer? If your token has a lot of liquidity, it means that you can build some very interesting use cases on top of that. Because if you have a very fast settlement layer, then any layer 2 that you build on it can settle very quickly at the end of the day and reach that finality that's important for transactions. Right? So back to monetary policy, one of the problems we see with QE and central banks is this velocity of money going down. Yeah. And it's a very big problem with the velocity of money going down because it's not increasing the productivity or stimulating the economy. With high throughput systems, you can increase that velocity again. So, moving from, M0, T1, T2, whatever scheme you want to make for that money flow, when you have a very fast settlement layer, you can accelerate that. And so it's a perfect use case for like cross-border transfers, FX. So if you want to go from euros to let's call it a very illiquid market, I don't know, maybe somewhere in Thailand or Singapore, having a bridge currency is a very effective way to do that without worrying about your counterparty, without having treasury management, without worrying about nostro vostro accounts, basically all the problems that the SWIFT system has. Yeah. So cross-border transfers is kind of Ripple as a company main product that they're trying to tackle. They're basically creating an alternative to the SWIFT system. And originally, what happened is that Ripple created something called RippleNet. And RippleNet is an internal company product where a bunch of banks and financial institutions, remittance providers decided on a particular rule set. We're going to agree to operate under these rules. We're going to add a compliance layer, KYC, AML, and we're going to create this bilateral messaging system. All right, so it's essentially the same as SWIFT, although more advanced. And so we're going to use blockchain technology at an enterprise scale to move money around the world without having to rely on SWIFT. Right, and so that's really the first major competitor to SWIFT in 50 years. And as you mentioned several times on your interviews, that transferring money internationally is very problematic because there's uncertainty on the transactions. It could go days in which you have the underlying volatility risk of the currencies. So everyone knows that SWIFT is broken. Right, it's not really useful. But what people don't know is that, in global recessions, capital contracts globally, right? It's almost like, the fountain shuts off to all those exotic corridors and the capital retrenches back to the banks where they need it for their reserves to weather the storm, right? So the SWIFT system is this system that naturally repatriates capital in a slow environment. And that's a problem for those emerging markets who need that liquidity to function. That's very problematic. We saw that with the swap lines that the central banks put in place. This need to provide liquidity into the global market to keep the engine running, because the risk-averse banks just don't want it.
Because the distribution of capital is held by the banks. So central banks can do what they want, but the banks are the first access point to capital. So it all comes down to them in the end. And when you've got an impaired banking system, Europe is a great example, capital doesn't go. It doesn't go out of the banking system. It's hard to leak out.
They're risk averse. They don't want to create any more exposure than they have to. So here's one of the main use cases where cryptocurrencies play a significant role is on-demand liquidity. And that's kind of their flagship product at this point. Ripple is saying, look, there's this liquidity that exists on the internet, right? Across the world. It's a global liquidity that anyone can grab at any time. And so they've decentralized liquidity. And that's a very alien concept because the way banks transact and mitigate their counterparty risk is with corresponding banking accounts. So, for example, Santander might have an account with a Japanese bank, and in that account will be their funds. And if they want to make some kind of cross-border transfer value, what happens is they just move the balance from Santander's account to the recipient's account. And so they use a messaging system, which is what SWIFT does, to initiate those transactions. Now, sometimes those messages have to go across a chain of banks. And so that's why there's very little transparency about how long it's going to take and exactly how much it's going to cost, how much slippage is going to be. Because you're using a chain of relationships that are legally established, right? These corresponding nostro vostro accounts to manage your cross-border transfers, your liquidity. So that arrangement was set up in the 1960s, right? That's nowhere near the capabilities we have today. So what on-demand liquidity does for the Ripple's product is say, look, you have this XRP in existence. The XRP has a certain amount of liquidity, right? It has a known market value. It's a transparent, permissionless ledger. And basically anybody can access that liquidity at any time. So why would you keep capital dormant in a corresponding banking account, right? If you have it there accessible when you need it, You trade into that, and then you exit out of it in just in the same way you would do any other FX transaction. So on-demand liquidity is the idea of decentralizing liquidity for access by anybody. Right? And this is a revolutionary concept. I don't think people